Well, this week, the United States will mark the 50th anniversary of one of the most historic days in the civil rights movement. The March on Selma, America's first family, will be attending the commemorative ceremonies on Saturday, and not just as part of their official duties.
And I know that when I take Malia and Sasha down with Michelle next week down to Selma, part of what I'm hoping to do is to remind them of their own obligations. Because there are going to be marches for them to march and struggles for them to fight. And if we've done our job, then that next generation is going to be picking up the torch as well.
Well, that torch even lit up the Oscars. Coleman and John Legend thrilled the audience with their theme song from the movie Selma. They used the time for their acceptance speeches to drive home the point that the events in Selma are not just a part of dusty history.
We wrote this song for a film that was based on events that were 50 years ago, but we say that Selma is now because the struggle for justice is right now. Yeah. We know that the voting rights act that they fought for 50 years ago is being compromised right now in this country today. We know that right now the struggle for freedom and justice is real.
Well, John Legend has it right there. The work is far from over. Well, joining us now is Charles Coleman, Jr., a civil rights attorney. Welcome, of course, back to the Rise viewers. Good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
What do you see as some of the major challenges ahead?
Well, I think in terms of where we go from here, the biggest challenge that we face is ensuring that the Black Lives Matter movement, if you will, the new era civil rights movement, doesn't become the next Occupy Wall Street. And what I mean by that is what needs to happen at this point, we've done awareness, we've done protests, we've done marches. We need to move to a specific and concrete legislative agenda that actually has a specific ask. I think if you talk to most of the average protesters in the street and you ask them, okay, so Black Lives Matter, we get it. You want changes, you want reform. What are you specifically asking for? Many of them don't know. And so I think now it's time to articulate and push for a concrete agenda that will actually bring about substantive change.
You make a really critical point there, Charles, because what we have seen and witnessed after these marches, of course, in Staten Island and Ferguson, and of course the much publicized case of George Zimmerman with Trayvon Martin, it's been turned over to the feds. They have seemed to find absolutely nothing they can pursue in terms of charges, at least in the Zimmerman case. Right. So what we have basically here is a legislative agenda, or at least a lack thereof of one.
Right.
How do we put one together?
Well, that's exactly what I think is the problem. When people have asked me, well, what do you think is going to happen with the DOJ's investigation with Darren Wilson or in Danny Pantaleo's case, I've said every time, it is actually very difficult for you to bring and sustain federal civil rights violations against officers of the law. And the reason for that is the burden is so very high. And I think what needs to happen is people from all sorts of sides of the coin, if you will, the intellectuals, the legal scholars, they need to be brought to the table to really do the think work in terms of how do we develop legislative backstops to keep these sorts of violations from happening and being okay with it.
Well, perhaps Attorney General Eric Holder is leaving office with both guns blaring, looking to see if he can enact different things and make positive changes. How effective do you think he might be going out of office at this particular point in time?
Well, his effectiveness isn't necessarily in his ability to get those changes enacted. What his effectiveness is the ability to use his bully pulpit, if you will, as the outgoing Attorney General, who everyone is still listening to, as a means of raising the conversation and generating conversation and awareness about it. He himself is not going to be in a position to make these changes happen. However, by sort of poking that and putting that sort of out in the public space where people are discussing it, he has now helped to start a conversation that I think needs to keep going.
And Loretta Lynch, if she's confirmed, I'm sure she'll pick up this banner, I would assume.
We would hope so. I don't necessarily know that I would be as optimistic about that with respect to social justice issues. I think that in certain places, Loretta Lynch is going to be very strong. I think, however, if you watch her confirmation hearing and you know a little bit about her history as a prosecutor, you should not necessarily expect Attorney General Holder Part 2. She is going to make a strong push to differentiate herself. Now, in this area, we are hopeful, and I think that, we want the best from her as Attorney General.
Okay, I just want to put this in here. You talk about legislation. I guess the question is, who do we put the burden on? And I say we, I'm talking about people of color here in this country. Republicans, Democrats, you've got Byron Allen's case, a $20 billion suit against Comcast and the media. And he says, I'm going to take the votes away from the Democrats, putting it on the Republicans. Who do we trust? Who do we go to?
We go to ourselves. And and at the end of the day, that's where every one of the movements for change in this country has started. It started at the grassroots level. It started with the people. And I think that this movement is no different. We have to ourselves develop this agenda, and we have to push for it ourselves, because we're the ones who are going to make that change happen. After we have decided what it is that we want, after we have articulated very clearly what our ask is, we then have to put the onus on our elected officials.
Well, I wish we could talk more about this. I'd say it's a tall order here. We've got a little bit more time here, but we have no leader or leadership like we had in the 60s.
Right.
There's no Malcolm X. There's no Martin Luther King. And I'm not going to talk about the current one who says he's a leader. What do we do? I mean, we haven't been directing any of this.
I think that's part of the problem as well. There's a generational gap, a rift between the old guard and the new guard. And in many respects, younger civil rights activists feel like we don't need one particular leader. We want to lead by committee. You have to deal with all of us. Now, frankly, I don't know how effective that will ultimately be in terms of when we do formulate and make that ask in terms of the democratic, everyone at the table model of leadership. I don't know how effective that will be.
Right.
But certainly the lack of a central voice is holding the movement back.
I would say so. Charles Coleman, as always, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Julian.
All right.